It's Judgment Day.
The judgment of this man in associating himself with extremists.
And when the Vice Admiral had had her say, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Libya was given the right of reply.
I think it's a pity that there were some tacky slogans. I wish it hadn't happened.
I'm sure ABC News in Canberra thinks it's a pity there are still loopy name supers going to air and wishes it wasn't happening. Welcome to Media Watch, I'm Jonathan Holmes. First tonight, they say that these days there are 3 media relations people for every working journalist. But what do they all do? Here's a revealing example.
A leaked proposal for an explosives factory in the Upper Spencer Gulf has been met with concern in Whyalla.
By the time the Adelaide media caught up with it, the proposed explosives factory story was old news in Whyalla. It had been covered more than a week earlier by the local paper, the Whyalla News.
Ready to Fight by Kate Bilney.
Being an industrious sort, Miss Bilney had been busy covering all the angles, including the fact that near the proposed site at Point Lowly is land used for training by the Department of Defence. On the 21st of March, she'd sent an email to Defence Media Relations in Canberra.
I was wondering if I could get some comments about whether this project would have any impact on the Defence Force or pose any safety risks.
4 simple questions followed. The next day, Defence Media Ops Officer Erica Seymour circulated a draft response for approval. It had to be signed off by a
subject matter expert.
And then by a
Group/service 1 star or above.
Which means someone of the rank of brigadier or higher. And then by a
Strategic Communications Advisor.
Who you and I would call a spin doctor. And lastly by
Colonel J. Squire DCAM.
Who's the Director, Communications and Media. Once she'd got all those approvals, Ms Seymour requested
OPALSEC AC.
That's short for Acknowledgement from the Office of the Parliamentary Secretary. And she copied that email to 43 other individuals and offices in the Defence Empire. It was also sent by mistake to a few journos, which is how we come to have a copy. And what was the draft response to Whyalla News' questions which all these people had to sign off on or know about? Here it is.
Defence has provided comment to the South Australian Department of Trade and Economic Development and advised that additional detail is required before a formal position can be provided.
Riveting, isn't it? It was approved on the 22nd of March, but Kate Bilney didn't receive it at the Whyalla News until
Wednesday, March 30th, 2011.
8 days later. Defence responded a good deal quicker than that to Media Watch's questions. A Defence spokesperson wrote,
The original inquiry from the Whyalla News was regrettably delayed in its delivery. Defence has apologised to the Whyalla News for this delay.
Needless to add, the Whyalla News hasn't used the Department of Defence's deeply uninformative response, which might well have been the result Defence was hoping for all along. Your taxes at work. And now to
Australia's most read columnist,
Andrew Bolt.
No one could accuse Mr Bolt of idleness. As well as his twice-weekly column in News Limited papers and his daily blog, he now has a spot every weekday morning with breakfast host Steve Price on Melbourne's talkback radio station MTR. Mr Bolt, I hardly need tell you, is one of the more strident sceptics in the land when it comes to man-made global warming. In fact, in his case, climate change scoffer might be a better term. Despite that, the Friday before last, the new Climate Commissioner, Professor Tim Flannery, bravely appeared on the show, and Bolt asked his favourite question.
On our own, cutting our emissions by 5% by 2020, what will that lower the world's temperatures by?
Bolt's been putting that question to every global warmist he can find for a while. This time, after a bit of flanneling by Flannery, Bolt struck gold.
If the world as a whole cut all emissions tomorrow, the average temperature of the planet's not going to drop for several hundred years, perhaps as much as 1,000 years, right? Because the system is overburdened with CO2 that has to be absorbed, and that only happens slowly.
That doesn't seem a good deal.
Gotcha. Andrew Bolt was a bit slow on the uptake, but Steve Price knows a headline when he hears one.
No meaningful change in world temperatures for 1,000 years.
And all this money.
This is not just if Australia does it.
If the
whole world does it.
Of course, Flannery didn't say no meaningful change, but Bolt ran big with the story in his column next morning.
PM's tax to make no difference to climate.
The same day, the Weekend Australian gave it a run.
The Gillard government's chief promoter of the climate change debate has admitted even a global effort to cut carbon emissions would not lower temperatures for up to 1,000 years.
Talkback radio was full of it for days, and pretty soon viewers began asking mediawatch why ABC News hadn't reported this crucial story. But it really isn't a story at all. Last Tuesday, to the paper's credit, the Australian's environment editor Graham Lloyd explained why.
Tim Flannery's 1,000-year carbon concession is a straw man. The aim of climate change action today is not to return to a cooler world of yesterday. The urgent aim is to stop the runaway speed of carbon emissions growth and global temperatures.
Which is the very point that Tim Flannery vainly tried to make on MTR, if you can hear him under Bolt's remorseless drone.
Well, our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren won't even notice the difference.
It'll just keep getting worse if we don't. That's the problem.
But I just want to get back to the facts.
The facts. Andrew Bolt isn't stupid, and it's not a hard point to grasp. Cutting emissions is like not piling more blankets on a child that's too warm in bed. With luck, the child won't get hotter still. But to make the child cooler, you have to take blankets off. And when the blanket is excess greenhouse gas already in the atmosphere, that's something humans can't do. As Tim Flannery wrote in a letter to the Australian published last Monday,
it highlights the importance of avoiding every kilogram of greenhouse gas emissions we can. For once in the atmosphere, they are extremely difficult to get out and have long-term consequences.
Now, it's not the job of ABC News or the Fairfax newspapers, which also ignored it, to point out that the Flannery story was flummery. But it is mediawatch's job, and now we've done it. Andrew Bolt, of course, had a torrid time of it last week. He spent it in court. He's being sued by 9 Aboriginal people over some columns and blogs that the Melbourne Herald Sun published 2 years ago. There's no question that they would have been deeply offensive to those 9 people, and indeed to plenty of other folk too.
It's so hip to be black. Meet the white face of a new black race. The political Aborigine.
In brief, Bolt accused the 9 and others, political activists, academics, artists, all of them light-skinned people of mixed ethnic descent, of choosing to identify as Aboriginal because that is
the one identity that has political and career clout.
He added that
this self-identification as Aboriginal strikes me as self-obsessed and driven more by politics than by any racial reality.
Andrew Bolt has admitted that he got some of his facts wrong. For example, in his original article, he wrote of academic Larissa Behrendt that she
has also worked as a professional Aborigine ever since leaving Harvard Law School, despite looking almost as German as her father.
And in a typically snide Boltism, he wrote that Behrendt
is often interviewed demanding special rights for my people. But which people are yours exactly, mein Liebchen?
But Behrendt's father was born in Australia to an Aboriginal mother, and her grandfather, despite his German name, came from England. If Behrendt had been suing Bolt for defamation, that mistake might have cost News Limited a lot of money. And it wasn't the only inaccuracy by a long chalk. But the 9 aren't suing for defamation. They're suing under the provisions of the Federal Racial Discrimination Act, which states in Clause 18C that it's unlawful to do something that
is reasonably likely in all the circumstances to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate another person or a group of people.
And
is done because of the race, colour or national or ethnic origin
of the people concerned. That provision in the Act comes under the heading
Prohibition of offensive behaviour based on racial hatred.
So for an offensive act to be unlawful, must it be motivated by or likely to incite racial hatred? The Act doesn't say so. In fact, other than in that heading, the word hatred doesn't appear at all. To my mind, to declare something unlawful just because it causes offence on the grounds of race or anything else is an unjustified curtailment of our freedom of speech. Admittedly, the Act does exempt.
A fair comment on any event or matter of public interest.
So far as I understand it from people covering the case, neither side has had much to say about that exemption. But you'd have to think the argument is coming about whether or not it applies. There's an irony here. Many countries have a Bill of Rights or a constitution that gives freedom of speech the status of a fundamental right. For example, there's the famous clause in the American Constitution.
Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press.
Clause 18C of Australia's Racial Discrimination Act would probably never have become law in the United States. And in the UK, a judge would have to weigh it in the balance against a legally recognised right to free speech. But in recent years, the push for a Bill or Charter of Rights in Australia has been rebuffed, not least thanks to a chorus of News Limited columnists like Andrew Bolt. Here's what he wrote in 2007.
A Bill of Rights is actually a bid for power by an unelected elite that has about exactly enough of it right now.
By unelected elite, Bolt meant the judges. In this case, a judge will decide whether he's breached an Act of Parliament unconstrained by any need to give special weight to freedom of speech beyond what the Act itself says. Much as I'd like to see Andrew Bolt apologise for his columns, I think it would be bad for our freedoms if he were told to do so by a court. But to some extent, he's helped to make the bed he finds himself lying on. In New South Wales, there's another legal battle going on with even more profound implications for freedom of the press.
Subpoena to produce. Plaintiff, New South Wales Crime Commission. Defendant, Police Integrity Commission.
Two of the state's most powerful criminal watchdogs are at war with each other, and the Sydney Morning Herald is caught in the crossfire. We'll look at that issue and the new federal shield law, which the states ought to adopt but so far haven't, next week. Until then, good night.